Today, let's procedurally generate character names in Unreal Engine. We'll do this using data tables. So let's jump right into it. Let's open up our content browser. First, we'll go to our blueprint category and we're going to create a blueprint function library. So in this library, we'll have all the functions that we need to create names, but we don't need it to be an actor and exist in the world. So let's create a function library, call it BPFL, blueprint function library. Let's call it name generation. We'll open that up. Here we have our function library. We have our default just new function. Let's rename this for something as generate name. Now in here, we can put whatever code we need to generate a name, and then we'll need an output. So we'll create a new output, and let's have this be a string. So this will be the name that we create. And then between these two, we'll have to have our code for creating the names themselves. Now let's think about how do we want to actually create a name. So in here, let's try to have a first name and a last name for our character. And let's even look at creating different names for, let's try different cultures. Let's go ahead and create a structure, blueprint structure. Here we'll call it F name. So this is the structure of what our name will be. Now here, let's say this can be a name, which is a string. And let's create some sort of way of indicating a culture for this name. So I'll reopen the content browser. Here we'll go to blueprint. We'll create an enumeration. So here you could call it E or enum. And let's call this culture. We'll add a couple. For now, let's just name them north, south, east, and west. Those could be whatever you want. They don't have to necessarily be cultures, but just some sort of category for different types of names. Now let's go back to our name structure. Here, we'll add a variable. Let's add in our enum culture. Here we go. And let's call it culture. Great. So now we have some sort of data structure that is a name and a culture. Let's close those. So in our generate name, we will probably want to use a data table that has all of our data in it for the different types of names. Get the names out of the data table. Maybe get a first name out of a first name table and a last name out of a last name table, and then combine those two to make an overall name. First, let's go and make a first name data table. So under miscellaneous data table, we could pick a row structure. So what kind of structure do we want? Let's use our F name that we just made. I'll name this DT data table. This will be, let's call it first names. So if we open that, we'll see we get some categories here. We get row name, we get a name and a culture. So let's add one as an example. If we click on this here, we can add in our name it test, and then we can choose north, south, east, west for the culture. For now, I'll delete that. Now, with this, instead of having to create all of them here in Unreal, let's go ahead and open up some sort of spreadsheet. I'll be using Google Sheets, but you could use any spreadsheet or just any way to even hand type CSV files if you want to populate this data table for us. So let's take a look at that now. All right, I've pulled up a Google Sheet here. Now this I've named first name. So here we could put all of our first name data that we want to use in our system. We'll have to make categories for our columns here that match this data table that we just made. So in column A, we'll use as the row name. Column B we'll call name, and column C we'll call culture. Now here for row names, we could just use as like 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, just to number them. You could really call them anything you want, but here I'll just number them, make it easy. Now we can add in some example names. Let's see, let's do all of them lowercase. You could do it however you want, but I'll keep them all lowercase here. So Josh, Alice, Bob, Smith, Dominique, and Teresa. Now for the cultures, I'll just give them random cultures here. So north, south, east, west, and then we'll copy north and south again. Now these, we want to make sure we spell these exactly the same as what they're spelled in Unreal, so that way they could be identified when we go ahead and import this data table, or this table we made into the data table in Unreal. So in order to download this, we'll go to File, Download as a CSV, and we can use this CSV to import the information into Unreal. All right, so now that we've downloaded that file, the CSV file, I'll go to my data table and hit re-import. Now here I have it in my downloads folder. And once I select that, then here it auto-populates for us, giving us character names and then the culture, and it already creates these cultures as the enumerations that we defined earlier. Now here you could go ahead and change anything, but ideally we just open up the Google Sheets again, edit it there, and re-import our data table with any sorts of updates that we want. Now let's see, now that we have some of this going, let's go ahead and go to our name generation and see how we can use these first names to start creating a name. So if I go to this function library, generate name function, let's look up how to get the data table. So we'll say get data table. Here we get different options. Let's go ahead and we could get data table row. Now this will get us a single row from our data table. We could do DT first names. Now here our rows are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we could choose different inputs, but how can we get a random input? So we could get all of the data table row names, choose a random name, and use that to get the full row. So let's look up get data table row names, and we could choose our same data table. Now this will give us an array, and we can choose to get a random one. So a random array item. Here I'll choose random array item from stream. So later we can use the stream to be able to control what seed we're using in the procedural generation process to get the same exact name each time for the same character. That way a single character's name isn't being procedurally generated and changed every time the game is run. We can connect our out item into our row name. Let's connect up these nodes. Row found. We'll connect to the output pin. Now on our row not found, this would be some sort of error. So I'll do a print string. I'll just call this error. We have to have a return node, just like something that's output. And the name output, we can say null or something like that, just to help us debug later if something goes wrong. We'll get an error and then we'll have a null name. Now, if we do find a data table row, we'll have our out row, and we'll say break. So we'll get our information here, and we have our name and culture. We can combine our name into our output there. Now in the future, we could look at how to get names that are only related to certain cultures. So if you want a character that is from like the South culture or East or West or North, we can change this logic here to only select certain cultures for certain names that we want to create. But for now, let's just see if we could get this working. So here we'll output our name. And I'll go ahead and create a UI to display this, and we'll take a look at it. First, once we compile this, we'll get an error because we don't have a random stream yet. So let's go ahead and make a random stream. And here it'll give us an initial seed of 0. Right now we'll leave it as a seed of 0, so it'll always give us the same thing. And then later we can go ahead and modify this as well. Now let's go ahead and see if this works. I created a quick UI that goes ahead when a button's clicked. We call our generate name function and display that name. So let's look at our map. We'll hit play. Here's our UI. When I hit new name, here we generated Alice. So let's go back to our name generation function. Instead of initial seed being set to 0 always, we can drag that as an input to our function. And if I look at my code for the UI, here we get an initial seed. I'll just give a random float out here, or a random int. Could give it a max, let's say 10,000. So now every time this runs, we should be getting a different name. Perfect. All right, now that we have a first name being created, let's go ahead and look at creating a last name. So if I return back to Google Sheets, I'll go ahead and create a second Google Sheet for our last names, and it'll have the same structure. So let me go ahead and copy this and create a new one. Go ahead and paste this into this last names. Now here, let's go ahead and change these. Here, I'll keep these shorter. We'll just give them letters so we could see the difference between the first and last names when we make them. There, so we just have a couple different letters. That way we can see the difference once we start generating. Now let me export this. We'll go download as our CSV file. Here in Unreal, one thing we can do is directly drag in this last names file. So let me go to my downloads last names. So I could directly drag it in, and we get an option to create a new data table. So here we'll import as data table. We'll choose our row type as our F name, and we'll leave these other options as default and hit apply. Let me move this into my right folder here. Rename this as DT last names. Let's go ahead and look at that and see what it looks like. Okay, great. So we have our name and culture here as well. Looks like that worked. Look back at our generate name, and let's start creating a last name. So this code is what we used to create the first name. So let me disconnect the return node here. I'll move it below. Now this name that we already created, let's promote to a local variable. So this will be the first name. So we'll save that as a local variable. Now when this is done, then we go ahead and generate the last name. So let me move this up. At the very beginning, let's put a sequence node to order this code or this blueprint. So we'll do all this stuff first. We'll comment this as generate first name. And then we'll do number 2 here, and this will be generating the last name. We'll do this in a similar way. For now, let's go ahead and just copy and paste this. You can always improve this code so we're not having to copy and paste and decrease the scalability of our blueprint here. But for now, let's just copy and paste this to make sure that we can get it working, and then you can always optimize it later. So for this section, let's comment, let's say generate last name. Here we'll select last names for our data table, last names in that data table. And let's use the same seed. So we just get one seed, and then it's used for both data tables. And now we're getting this name here. Let's promote this to a local variable. we'll say this is the last name. Again, we can have an error catching section here in case anything ever goes wrong. Let's just connect our rows not found both to go to that same error and just return null. All right, back over to our sequence. So after generate the first and last name, then we can combine them to create the overall name. So let's make this section, let's say this, it will be combined names together. There we go, organize that a bit. So to combine the names together, we can combine the first name with the last name as strings. So here we can use an append string. We could get two different strings, and then the return is their combination. Here we'll actually need 3 pins. So we'll do the first name. Then on B, we'll do a space. And then we'll do our last name. That way we have first name, space, last name. Let's save and compile that. We should now be procedurally generating names. We'll be getting a first name and a last name, but we're not yet using the culture. And we'll look at that later here. But let's go into our map. I'll hit play, and we could test this out. So Bob H, Alice G. So sometimes we'll get the same names depending on what the seed is, but we should be getting random names here. Random combinations of first and last name. But we only have so many in our list that we'll see repetitions quite often. So the more options there are in both lists, the less we'll see repeats. Well, perfect. Now that that's working, you have the basis for creating procedural names in Unreal. But let's take this a step further and see if we can use these cultures we've set up to further dictate what names can be combined. The one way we can approach using these cultures is to look at the column of our list of cultures here in the data table and filter through this list to select what row we want to use. So there's different ways we can kind of use culture here to select names. One could be to just use different data tables for each different culture. However, then you have to maintain all these different kinds of data tables. So let's try to use one data table with all the different culture names, but filter based on culture what names we can use when we're creating the name. So let's look at our name generator here. Now, first, let's look at this first name section. So we're creating we're getting all the row names from the data table, picking a random one, and getting that row. But what if we limit which rows we can select based on the culture? So if we right click, we can search for data table column. So here we get different options. Data table names. We could get data table column as string. So this will get all of the options in a particular column in our data table. Let me zoom in on this. Could get our data table first names. If we look at property name, this would be our column name. So here, culture. Let's double check. Yep, culture. So this return value, these are all of the potential options in that row. So this is culture north, south, east, west, north, south is what that should give us. So we can go ahead and iterate through each of these, check if it matches the correct culture. And if it is the wrong culture, then we should remove that row from our array of rows. So from this, what we want to do is a for each loop. So for every one of these different cultures, we could say if this equals, I guess this gives it to us as a string here rather than the enum. So here we're getting our column as a string. So it's no longer this enum, this north enum, it's a string with the text of north. So we need to look through our enums and determine whether or not this string equals a particular enum. Now let's choose a enum that we want to keep. So let's get enum culture, or maybe we'll say just enum culture, get literal enum culture. And let's save this as a local variable. And I'll name that as selected culture. Let's plug that in just at the front here. And we'll leave it as north just for now. We can randomize that later. So right now we're trying to choose north culture. So we'll grab our selected culture and we'll do toString to get the string version of this enum. And we'll compare it. We'll do case insensitive. We'll compare our column culture name to the actual selected culture that we're going to use. And we'll say if they match, let's add some reroute nodes, keep this a little clean. If these match, then we'll go ahead and keep that row. So we'll keep the name associated with that culture. If not, then we'll delete it. So how do we do that? Let's keep track of the indices that we want to get rid of. The indices will be which row that this element is, and we'll remove those indices from our target array. So from our array of names, we'll remove the ones that don't match this culture, but we'll have to keep track of which indices to remove. So I'll drag off this index array, type in add. Let's add it to an array, and let's create a local variable for this array. So let's call it indices to remove. Now, when do we want to remove those indices? That'll be when our array element is not equal to the selected culture. So if those are equals as false, we'll add that index to an array to remove. Otherwise true, we'll just keep with our loop. Let me make this a bit bigger. We'll first let's drag our starting node up here. So from our sequence, we'll first determine what indices to remove. When that's completed, we'll get our data table row names. But before we actually use it, we'll get our indices to remove, and we'll just iterate through these. So indices to remove. Here we'll look at a reverse for loop. So we'll go backwards through the array, removing things. Let's connect that up. So we'll get our data table row names, go backwards through our indices to remove, and we'll remove them from our rows. So this will say remove item or remove index, connect it to the loop body, use our array element. Let's clean up some of these nodes here. We should save this, actually. Let me delete these connections, make it a little cleaner. Let's save this as a local variable. That way when we remove it, there's something we're like actually saving. So local variable, we'll call this as first name rows to use. We'll have a very descriptive name there. So we're going to remove indices from our first name rows to use. And this is based on our culture. When that's done, then we'll go ahead and get the data table rows. And our target array will be the first name rows to use. So let's organize this a bit more. All right, so first, this top second section will be our determine which rows match, the selected culture. Then this next section, let's make a new comment. This will be the filter what data table rows based on culture. So that's actual filtering of it, and we get our first name rows to use. And then this last section will be get name from filtered rows. Perfect. So here at the end, we won't need the culture here because we're just using the culture as we get them from this string. And we're comparing it to the enum, our selected culture up here. Now, currently our selected culture is always north. So we could change that to be random based on the same seed. But for now, let's leave that as just north. Make this comment box a bit bigger. Drag out this error option. Perfect. So let's go ahead and test this. I'll compile and save it. We should only be using our selected culture, which is north, for our first name. So let's look at our first names. We should only be using Josh and Dominique. So let's go hit play. Let's see what we get. We're only getting Josh and Dominique, but we're getting lots of random last name letters. Perfect. Let's go back looking here. Let's test it with another. Let's test it with South. So what names do we have for South? We have Alice and Teresa. See, Teresa and Alice. Nice, so only Teresa and Alice. So we're able to filter what names we're selecting based on what culture we're selecting. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and also use the culture in this same manner that we used here to generate last names, to also filter the last names based on culture. And then you could go ahead and randomly select in enum, so if you want it to be a random culture, or you could change the UI to let the player select what culture they're going to use as their own character, or if you have procedurally generated characters, they might already have a culture and you use that as input, in which case we drag out the culture here. And on our input, instead of enum that was generated, we'll name this as culture. So now this function to generate names, we get a seed and whatever culture the character is. And our output will be a first name and a last name that's created based on that culture. So I hope this video was helpful for you to see how you could approach these procedural generation problems in Unreal Engine and use data tables with CSV files to help you fill out lists of names. If you want to see more content like this, please subscribe and let me know if you have any feedback on the videos or video requests. I'll see you in the next video.